Greetings, everyone. It's good to be here with you. And welcome to all of you folks out on the DVD program. I wanted to mention also before we get started, too, that we do have a mini correspondence course. For some of you that are taking the DVDs and are not enrolled in our correspondence course, you may do so by just writing to us at Church of God, New World Ministries at P.O. Box 5536, Sevierville, Tennessee, 37864. We also have a traditional Christian doctrine series that is available upon request. Same address, and we'd be glad to send those out to you as well. We received a email from the fellow that runs BibleStudy.org recently, and apparently right on the front page there became a real good opening, and he agreed to give us that slot for about $70 more. So I said, well, sure, we'll take it. So we're advertising our traditional Christian doctrines on the front page as well as our correspondence course. Mr. Tinkler tells me that we're getting an exorbitant number of visits, and they're really reading our articles. We're up, I guess, close to 350, 60,000 reads on that website. So if you haven't visited our site, do so, cognwm.org, and there's tons of articles and tons of sermons to listen to out there. I want to begin today by an introduction. An introduction to someone that we all know well. When I was young, I remember them talking about the devil. And they used to explain that the devil was dressed in a red suit, had a long pointed tail, and he had horns. And that was my idea, my concept of what the devil was like. Now, when I went to high school, they reinforced that because our slogan, or our what do you call it, mascot, we were called the North Fork Elkhorn Blue Demons. And so we had a picture of that same devil, but it was blue on our outfits and on our jerseys and so forth. We were called the Blue Demons. So people have known and heard about this devil for years. I remember my grandmother, and looking back now, I'm sure it's an old wives' tale, but she said, you know, the devil chased her mother around the house. And she said, oh, he was a handsome man. And I don't know how people get ideas like that started, but we've always known about the devil. And going all the way back into history, people have known about demons and devils. And people have written about it. Dante's Inferno talks about the devil and what he's going to be doing to us. You know, he's working feverishly down there punching people with a pitchfork as they shovel coal for the rest of their life and burning hell fire. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this devil, but only that's not going to be my subject, but it's going to come in later on and play about him. So I want to cover a couple of basic scriptures back in 1 Peter 5 and verse 8. This is a warning from Peter to God's people. He says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks around as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Now, the word there is to drink down or to gulp up or consume. So the devil is going to try to consume God's people. Verse 9, whom resist steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. Many times we in God's church, maybe we expect special protection, and maybe we can get that. But sometimes it rains on us just as hard, or sometimes harder, than it does the people in the world. And a lot of people have become disenchanted with God because, well, I'm in your church, and why am I having all these problems and trials? Well, Peter said, count it all joy when you fall into those trials and temptations, because it helps us to develop character. The second scripture I wanted to go to was Matthew 12:24. Matthew 12:24. I'm just going through these very quickly and briefly, but to lay a groundwork of what we're going to be talking about a little later. But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow does not cast out devils, but by Beelzebub, the prince of the devils. Well, that's Satan, the devil. He's the prince. He is the chief devil, if you will. I wouldn't want to be in that position, but that's what he is. That's Satan, the devil. So they called him the prince of the devils. Going on over to Ephesians 2 and verse 2, he's called the prince of the power of the air. Now, I wish I understood that more. I've always understood or been taught that he has the ability some way to influence people. Maybe through the airwaves, maybe through thoughts. I really don't know. I've had different people explain it, but he's called the prince of the power of the air, so we do know that he is able to influence people by some means. In John 14:30, he's called the prince of this world. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but Satan the devil is alive and well on planet Earth. I've heard some people say that, oh, he's locked up in heaven. The Bible doesn't say that. It does not say that Satan the devil is locked up in heaven. It says that Christ said, I beheld Satan as lightning cast to the earth. And we read that he was cast down to the earth, and he was here when Adam and Eve was created. We read in Matthew 4 where Christ was tempted by the devil. He's the tempter. He will put things out there that looks real good to you. And sometimes he tempts people to transgress God's law, because human beings have a tendency to want to do the things that feel good and things that are easy. And Satan makes it that way for us. 2 Corinthians 4:4, he's called the God, little g, of this world. So Satan is still here, and this is his world. Christ is not in competition trying to save the world now. If he were, he would do it. But he's allowing Satan to do his work. And he's doing it very well. Because we read in Revelation 12:9 that he has deceived the whole world. When I first heard that scripture, I said, that's impossible. But the more I see of the world and every conceivable continent, every conceivable country on this earth, they're arguing, they're fussing, they're fighting, they're killing. And there's no peace anywhere on this earth. And all the different doctrines that they have and the different beliefs that they have, the different gods that they worship, you begin to see that, yes, he truly has deceived the whole world. In Revelation 9, verse 11, he's called Abaddon or Apollyon, which simply means destroyer. Satan's mission, after he went bad, after he lusted after God's throne and wanted to take over God's kingdom and become the one in charge, and God cast him back to this earth, his mission has been to destroy this earth, and particularly members of God's church, because he knows that they are the ones that are preparing right now to replace him. Christ will be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, but the saints that are training right now will be ruling with Christ and replace Satan and his demons on this earth. So he hates us with a passion, and he's out to destroy us. He wants to destroy mankind, and as I said, particularly God's church. Now in 2 Corinthians 2, the Apostle Paul sends out a message to the church in Corinth. 2 Corinthians 2, let's begin reading in verse 7. Now, we're breaking into a thought here, and I'll explain what's happened here. He says, so that contrariwise, you ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Now, in 1 Corinthians 5, if you remember, during the days of unleavened bread, this young man was having an illicit sexual relationship with his stepmother. And so they had to put him out of the church. Now, Paul is writing back now in 2 Corinthians in another letter, and he's saying, look, he's had enough punishment. He's repented, he's changed, but the people were coming down hard on him. And he says, he's explaining to them that you've got to forgive this guy and bring him back into the church. If God forgives us, then surely the people would. But he says in verse 8, wherefore I beseech you that you would confirm your love toward him. Confirm it. Bring him back in. Wrap your arms around him. Embrace him. For to this end also did I write, that I might know the proof of you. You know, God tests us and he proves us. And many times that's by our fruits, by our actions, by our deeds. God knows what's in our hearts. Whether you be obedient in all things. And remember what Christ said? If you don't forgive others, he will not forgive you. And Mr. Taylor expounded on that concept just recently in a sermon. Now, to whom you forgive anything, I forgive also. For if I forgave anything, to whom I forgave it, for your sakes forgave I it in the person of Christ. Now, notice verse 11. If you don't forgive, now this is one of Satan's devices, is to get you so upset with someone or something that you take your eyes off the kingdom, that you cannot forgive. And if you can't forgive, then God can't forgive you. So he says, lest he should get advantage of you, for we are not ignorant of his devices. So one of the things he's saying here is if you can't forgive people, since Satan can, if he is the prince of the power of the air, can stir you up to the point that you don't want to forgive. And I had to agree with Mr. Taylor when he says sometimes it takes a long, long time to forgive. But you pray about it, you think about it, you meditate about it, you study on God's Word, you know what you have to do, and with God's help you can do it. You can forgive, and that's what's required of us. But one of Satan's devices is don't forgive. He keeps putting that little thought in mind. You think how what they did to you. You know how wrong they were to you. They shouldn't have done that to you. They shouldn't have taken that from you. They shouldn't have put you in that position. And you just reason it out. Next thing you know, you're angry at that person. I've known people even come to church and wouldn't speak to other members of the church. Wouldn't speak to them. I've known people who wouldn't even go to the same congregation. If they said, are they going to the AM church meeting? And they said, well, I'm going to the PM. They would not. I don't know how they're going to be in God's kingdom. I can't see how that can happen. Because God says you must forgive 70 times 7. So one of his devices is that he is subtle, he is wicked, he is evil, he is charismatic, and he's very shrewd. Else how would he have tempted Eve? Now he went with her and he gave some truths, but he also gave some half-truths. And he was able to get her to actually reject God's way and make a decision that actually caused all of mankind to be cut off from God's Holy Spirit through his subtleness. He is called the whispering enchanter, whispering sweet nothings in your ear, and really amounts to nothing, but people give heed to it, and they yield to Satan's devices all the time. So, keep in mind that he does want to destroy us. He hates us. He's very shrewd, and he has all the time in the world up until Christ comes back and puts him in a place of restraint. And he says he's going to work very diligent to destroy as many of God's people as he possibly can. I've known, by the device that I'm going to tell you about today, I've known people that fell prey to it. And I want to show you one of his devices today. I want to show you that by going, first of all, to 2 Peter. Again, 2 Peter. 2 Peter 2. You know, it's been the same in God's church from the beginning. There's always been someone or some group that tries to distract people from God's way. It's no different here. And Peter's going to show you some, and beginning reading in verse 10, he says, chiefly them that walk after the flesh in the lust of uncleanness. They despise government. They're presumptuous. They're self-willed. They are not afraid to speak evil of dignities. There are people that don't mind speaking out about God's truth. They have no fear in them of God. So they don't mind speaking out. They're trying to do, it says they're self-willed and they want to do what pleases themselves. But they'll come with scriptures. And they will come with such a message. Some of them are very charismatic. Mr. Shelton and I were talking about one this morning, one of the ministers. He said, boy, that guy was young. He knew the scriptures. He walked across that stage and he had the people's command. The women were just sitting there drooling, you know, oh, what a handsome guy this is. He has methods. He has ways of getting his message across. Now, going on to verse 12, though, it says, but these as natural brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, they speak evil of the things that they understand not. You know, people will downgrade God's church. They'll talk about Sabbath keepers. They'll talk about that old Feast of Tabernacles. They don't even understand it. They don't know what the feast means. They don't understand it at all, but they'll speak evil about it, and they'll think you're a nut because you do it. And they'll make fun of you. That's the way people are. And they shall utterly perish in their own corruption. And yes, they shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. Spots they are and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings while they feast with you. And there are people in God's church that are that way. Having eyes full of adultery. They have adulterous minds and they can't get their minds off of it. They've done it all their life and they can't overcome it. They have eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls. And many of them will say, well, that's okay. It's okay if, you indulge just a little bit of extracurricular activity. They have a heart that has exercised with covetous practice, cursed children. Now, notice verse 15. Which have forsaken the right way, and they're gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. Now, he's talking about Balaam here. What is it that Balaam did that got him off track? Well, let's go to Jude, the 11th chapter. Jude, well, not 11th chapter, 11th verse. There's only one chapter in Jude. And verse 11 says, woe unto them, for they have gone the way of Cain. He gives you three examples here of people that have gone contrary to God's way. Cain, who was self-willed and self-righteous and wouldn't offer the sacrifices God required. And they ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward. So we see here, get a clue that Balaam was doing whatever he did to get money for it. And then they perished in the gainsaying of Korah, who was rebellious against Moses. Now, let's go back and see just what old Balaam did. Let's go back to Numbers 22. Many people have thought that Balaam was a prophet of God. And indications are he did make some prophecies that God inspired him to make because he couldn't do otherwise. But Balaam was not a prophet of God. Balaam was a false prophet. Now, in these days, the pagans had all types of gods. They worshiped the sun. They worshiped the moon. They worshiped the earth. They worshiped the wind. They worshiped sex. And sex was an integral part of a lot of the worship. Hence we have the obelisks, the Baal Peor, the god of the opening, and many of those scriptures that we find in the Bible and words that once you study into them, you understand that sex played an integral part in their worship. Now, one of the things that they would do, they would sacrifice their animals, and many times they would drink the blood, and then they would take the various parts of these animals and they would send them to these prophets. And the prophets would a lot of times look in, you've probably read in the scripture sometime where they looked in the liver. Well, they would look in the liver, and I don't know what they were looking for in there, but it would also give them some idea of some of the prophecies, and they would make prophecies based upon the livers and based upon the body parts. So part of their worship was animals and the different body parts from these different animals. So that's who Balaam was. Now, the scenario here is that the children of Israel are going into the promised land. And what did God say? He said, if you go into the promised land, he says, I will cast out all these foreigners, these Gentiles before you. If you obey me, I will fight for you. So they're going in, and they're beginning to defeat these different armies. Now, we come in verse 1 of Numbers 22, and it says, the children of Israel set forward, and they pitched in the plains of Moab on this side of Jordan by Jericho. So there they were pitched, and they were getting ready to move across Jordan and begin to destroy these pagans. That's what they were going to do. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. They weren't blind. They had spies out there, and they saw what God had done to the Amorites. They defeated them. As long as they obeyed God, he would continue to defeat them. And so he's worried. He said, this group of people, he says, a lot of them. And he says, they're powerful warriors, and they're going to come down here, and they're going to destroy us. And Moab was so afraid of the people because they were many, and Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. He's beginning to wonder, what can I do? He's going to work out a plan, a scheme. And so Moab said unto the eldest of Midian, now shall the company lick up all that are round about us. In other words, they're going to come through and just consume everything. You ever see a herd of cattle or that go into a field and they just completely eat it all up? They lick it all up, they just consume it, and they have to move them to another field. Well, that's the analogy he's using here. He says they're going to destroy everything before them. Just as the ox licks up the grass of the field, and Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time. So he sent messengers, therefore, unto Balaam. Now remember, Balaam, they thought that these prophets could make intercession to these various gods. In other words, he was one of the more famous at that time. It's like if you wanted, I guess, to hire an entertainer, you might, in your day, have hired Elvis Presley, who was one of the biggest of his day. So they were going out for the big guys here, and they went out for Balaam, and they wanted him to come in and said, look, so we realize that you make intercession, and with all these other gods, these pagan gods, and I'm sure they use sorcery and trickery and so forth to get their accomplishments, but they were going to hire him. They were going to hire him because they looked at the God of Israel as just like any of these other pagan gods. And so they were going to send Balaam to try to persuade this God of Israel to curse Israel and punish them so that they would not defeat them. So that's the scenario we have here. So he sent messengers, therefore, to Balaam, the son of Beor, to Pethor, which is by the river of the land of children of his people, to call him, saying, behold, there's a people come out from Egypt. Behold, they cover the face of the earth, and they abide over against me. So they laid it out. Says these people, they were taking captivity down in Egypt, and I'm sure they heard about it when God brought them out of Egypt, because he destroyed that great nation in that flood when they crossed through the Red Sea, and God destroyed them. Certainly they knew about that, so they understood about it. And so he says in verse 6, come now, therefore, I pray you, curse this people, for they are too mighty for me. Peradventure I shall prevail, that we may smite them, and that I may drive them out of the land. For I would that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. He says, you're a pretty powerful man, so we believe if you will be able to persuade their God to curse them, that he will curse them and take his protection away from them, and we'll be able to defeat them. And the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the rewards of divination in their hand. Oh yeah, they took the booty, they took the money, the gold, whatever it was, they took it to him and offered it to him. Here's your payment. All you got to do is get this God to curse these people, and we'll be glad to pay you for it. Well, it didn't work out that way for them. God told him, says, no, I'm not going to let you curse them. He says, he's not going to do it. These are my people. So Balak, he went back and told Balak, says, I can't do it. God won't let me do it. Well, he says, move over here to another high place. So he took him over to one of the more religious sites, and they sacrificed all these animals, and they sent the livers, and they sent the various body parts. He said, look in here and see what you can find out. See if God's sending you any messages. And the message was, no, you're not going to curse Israel. They're my chosen people. Now, continuing on for chapters 22 through 24, we see that God actually used Balaam for about 7 prophecies. And one of them was to predict when Christ would come to the earth. He couldn't help it. God spoke to him, he had to speak, and he had to say what God put in his mouth. So, it looks like that they got out of it, and the Israelites, and nothing happened. But let's go over to Numbers 25 and see what happened. Now, Israel abode in verse 1 in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. You know, when you live in a country like, I'm in Tennessee right now, but Tennessee, you can go through Tennessee, you can go up to Kentucky, you can go over here to Virginia, and there's a lot of surrounding states, and we intermingle. We can go from one state to another, we can meet people, we can go to restaurants, we can do whatever we want to. So apparently at this particular period of time, these daughters of Moab were coming down to meet these Israelites. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods. And the people did eat and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. What were they doing? They were having sexual relations with these Moabitic women. And these Moabitic women were using their influence to get them to go against the true God and begin to sacrifice to these pagan gods. And the Lord said to Moses in verse 4, take all the heads of the people and hang them up before the Lord against the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may be turned away from Israel. Well, some of them were going to die because of it. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, slay ye every one his men that were joined unto Baal Peor. So God was going to punish them for sacrificing to these false gods. And behold, one of the children of Israel came, and notice how blatant they were. One of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren and a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. He took her right on in the tent. Well, Phinehas saw what was taking place, and if you continue to read on, he went and got a spear and rammed it through both of them and killed them both. Well, God looked upon him with much favor for doing that, and as a result of that, it stopped the plague. Well, what was Balaam's error? What did he do that we read about from Peter and from Jude? He says he couldn't curse them. So what was his error? He wanted the money, get it, because he wouldn't let them, or at least it appears that he didn't get it, because God wouldn't allow him to curse them. So in order to find the answer, let's go to Numbers 31. Let's see exactly what Balaam did. Well, the children of Israel continued their conquest. In verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites. Afterward shall you be gathered unto your people. And Moses spoke unto the people, saying, arm some of yourselves unto the war, and let them go against the Midianites, and avenge the Lord of Midian. And he took 1,000 out of all the tribes, had 12,000 in all. Verse 6, and Moses sent them to war, 1,000 of every tribe, them and Phinehas the son of Eleazar, the priest, to the war, with the holy instruments and the trumpets to blow in his hand. So they had a blowing of trumpets, which symbolizes war, and they went out to fight against the Midianites. And they warred against the Midianites, and the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all the men, all the males. They slew the kings of Midian, beside the rest of them that were slain, namely Evi and Rekem and Zur and and Reba, 5 kings of Midian. Oh, who else gets slayed? Balaam, also the son of Beor. They slew him with the sword. So he was there with the Midianites, and he got caught up in the war, and they killed him as well. And the children of Israel took all the women of Midian captives and the little ones, and took the spoil of all their cattle and all their flocks and all their goods. So they spoiled them. And they burnt all their cities wherein they dwelt, and all their goodly castles with fire. And they took all the spoil and all the prey, both of men and of the beasts. And they brought the captives and the prey and the spoil unto Moses and Eleazar the priest, and unto the congregation of the children of Israel, unto the camp at the plains of Moab, which are by Jordan near Jericho. And Moses and Eleazar the priest and all the princes of the congregation went forth to meet them without the camp. They wanted to go see what was taking place. And Moses was wroth with the officers of the host, with the captains over the thousands, and over the hundreds, which came from the battle. Well, why was he upset with them? Moses said unto them, have you saved all the women alive? Well, they weren't doing anything wrong. They were all pretty, you know, and so we just saved them. Behold, these caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam. Oh, and now we see what Balaam did. Balaam couldn't curse them, but he went to the Midianites. He said, look, all you got to do is send your women down there and have them flirt with those men, and they'll fall for them head over heels. That's exactly what they did. Now, who do you think was behind this? Satan, the devil. Balaam was a false prophet. False prophets are Satan's prophets. So he used the women, and he used, in this particular case, sex. And the children of Israel fell for it head over heels. So we see Balaam's error. So he got his reward, and then he got his reward up here in verse 8. They killed him. He went against God. Now, Satan the devil is pretty shrewd. We've already established that. He's knowledgeable, and he does know human beings. Even Christ, he tried to use human temptations against him. He said, just bow down and worship me, and I'll give you all this stuff. He thought that Christ would be greedy, and thought that Christ would jump at the opportunity to be under Satan, but still rule the world. Well, Christ didn't fall for that. He also tried to tempt him. He says, jump off this building, the angels will protect you. Christ says, no, you don't tempt the Lord thy God. He knew the Scriptures better than Lucifer, but Lucifer was twisting them. And he's always done that. Now, from the very earliest times, when you go back to Genesis, the 6th chapter, what was taking place? We read back there that every imagination of their heart and mind was evil. Do you think, at that particular period of time when God says, I'm going to wipe them all out, that there were any sexual deviation going on in that period of time? Well, of course there were. They were perverted. And God hated it. Even though it doesn't come right out and say it, it had to be. That's the way human nature is. So I'm sure there was perversion going on. When you come to Genesis, I think it's 18:19, where Sodom and Gomorrah. What was taking place in Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, these two cities had come to the point that homosexuality was a way of life with them. It took time. It took the leadership to yield to it. And most of the people had to accept it. I'm sure they used the same term that we use today. Well, most of the people agree with it, so it must be okay. You know, if you think the majority of people agree with it, then it must be okay. So we see that sex was used back in Sodom and Gomorrah. And it was perverted sex. And what happened? The only ones that got out was Lot and his daughters. Even his wife had become so acclimated that as she started to leave, she couldn't help it. She had to look back to see what she was leaving. And she turned into a pillar of salt. You see, even Lot, he was, it says, vexed by what was going on, but he had been acclimated. He still stayed there. He was still living in the area. He was still in that town. I guess that's where he had to live, but he became softened to it. And that's what happens. We read the story. It's an interesting story. Back in Genesis 38, this tradition among the Israelites that when children married, brothers married, if they were a large family, and in Judah's, they had a large family, and apparently this lady named Tamar had married a brother, one of Judah's sons, and he passed away. Well, Judah told her, says, and when my youngest son gets old enough, he says, we'll marry you and you'll be able to continue the tradition. Well, it didn't happen that way. He wouldn't marry her, and so she went out in the field and was sitting out in the field and covered her face, and she looked like a harlot. Well, here comes Judah marching by, and he looks over, whoa. So he goes over and propositions her. And, of course, she agreed with it. So he had a relationship with her. And he says, now, I'll send you, payment. He said, well, how will I know that? She said. He said, give me that ring, your signet, and your staff. And says, I'll hang on to it till payment comes and I'll give it back. Well, several months went by, and it came up that Tamar became pregnant. Judah called her forth and says, you've been playing the harlot, haven't you? I love this, the way the Bible works. And she said, yes, I guess I have. And he said, well, who is it? And she says, well, the guy that this ring and this staff belongs to. He hit him like a ton of bricks because it was his. He says, you've been more righteous than I. So we see here now, and then we know that the twins that were born, how that played in history as well. So sex came into play there. Well, we know that Rahab, the lady when the walls come tumbling down, she hid and protected the spies, was a harlot. And Christ, of course, was a descendant from her. So I'm sure that she had a pretty good business going on there. But God called her, and shows you can, no matter who you are, you can be called. You've certainly heard the story of David and Bathsheba. David, the righteous king, who happened to go out on his veranda and started looking around, and something caught his eye down there, this lady that was bathing down there, Had to be a beautiful lady. But anyway, he lost all sense of reasonableness. I guess all the scriptures that was in his mind, thou shalt not commit adultery and fornication and all that, just went by the wayside. And he had to sin for her. She looked so good, and next thing you know, he was getting her husband killed to get him out of the way, and then he thought everything was good, and then here comes a little baby along. And so God came in and he found him out, and of course the baby died because of it. But we see sex was involved with David and Bathsheba. Now, I'm sure Satan was right there wringing his little hands in glee. Oh, look what I've done. Possible king of Israel. And then, of course, you remember Samson. That was one of his big problems. Delilah got to him as well. Sex has been involved from the very beginning. And Satan knows that. He knows that that's a weakness of man. And he has been able to use it. 1 Corinthians 5, we read where there was fornication of the stepson with his stepmother, actually, the son with his stepmother. And how can we forget 1 Kings 16? Let's go back over there, 1 Kings 16. Let's begin reading here in verse 29. And in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Ahab, the son of Omri, to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. They actually sacrificed, some of those kings actually sacrificed their firstborn children to Molech, the false pagan god. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, pagans to the core, the Zidonianites were, and went and served Baal, the false god, and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. Baal means many gods. Balaam was many gods. Baal was one of the gods, but they worshiped just about everything. It's like I remember the Indians. They used to talk about the Great Spirit and the weather and the earth and the wind, and they worship all types of different gods. And Ahab made a grove, and it was in the groves that they'd go out, and it's like they would skin the trees, you know, and make long obelisk type things. That's where I think we get many of the totem poles that the Indians used to have. Those were nothing more than their gods. You may have seen some of the old totem poles. They had pictures carved out on them, and that, of course, was some of the groves, and that's where they did their work, and did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. Now, the one that was leading all this is where Ahab yielded to Jezebel. You ever hear the slang expression when someone says, well, you're nothing but an old Jezebel, meaning painted eyes, painted lips, prostitute, old Jezebel. And old Jezebel was able to get Ahab to worship false gods. Now, the interesting thing about their worship was, and it goes all the way back to Semiramis and Nimrod. Did you ever wonder how Semiramis was able to get all those men to come into the temple and believe all those mystery religious traditions? Well, they had temple prostitutes, and they included that as part of their worship services. Sexual relations, come to church and worship your God. And your God, of course, was sex. And it was an integral part, and it's carried all the way down till today. Hence, we have the steeples on the churches. I think the Washington Monument is nothing more than an obelisk, and our people just don't realize that. But it was in the groves where all this chicanery took place, and it originated from the Babylonian mystery religion. Now, what's that got to do with us? What's that got to do with Satan the devil? What's Balaam's era have to do with us today? Lots. Let's go to Revelation 2. When we come to the book of Revelation means revealing. It's Christ revealing things to us. And we understand that Christ is revealing a message to his church, things that are shortly going to take place. We also know that in Revelation 2 and Revelation 3, there were 7 churches on a mail route. And those 7 churches were sent messages from the angel. And the angel was a messenger who took messages to them. And I personally believe that these messages were to God's church from then all the way down till today. Messages that are relevant to God's church. And I'll show you how this is going to work now. Revelation 2, notice verse 12. He sends a message, the angel of the church of Pergamos, write, these things says he, which has a sharp sword with 2 edges. He said, I know your works and where you dwell, even where Satan's seat is. Well, Satan is all over this earth. He deceived the whole world. So wherever man is living, Satan is there. So he must have a strong foothold here in Pergamos. And he says, you hold fast my name. Oh, yeah, you still call yourself the church of God. And you have not denied my faith. You still have some semblance of faith and trust in me. Even in those days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwells. So there must have been a martyr at that particular time that was included here. But I've got a few things against you, because you have there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam. What was his error? Well, to get you mixed up in illicit sexual relationships. And he says, to God's church, there's some among you who are teaching this, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. Now, continuing on, verse 15, so have you also them that hold the doctrine of Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. He says, repent, and I will come unto you quickly, and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. In other words, you bring his word. And he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. To him that overcomes will I grant to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knows, saving he that receives it. He says, you'll be in my kingdom if you overcome. Going on to verse 18, and to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these things says the Son of God, who has his eyes like as a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. That's describing Christ. I know your works, and your love, and your service, and your faith, and your patience, and your works, and the last to be more than the first. Notwithstanding, God's church, I have a few things against you, because you allowed that woman, Jezebel, and this is no doubt a type of the Jezebel we just read about, who was able to get Ahab to worship false gods. Now, no doubt there was a woman there, and we know that the woman symbolizes a church, and a prostitute symbolizes a false church in biblical terminology. So, you allowed that woman, Jezebel, which called herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. God says that even his church will be influenced by these sexual connotations. Now we say, well, that's not possible. Well, it says we are not to be ignorant of his devices. Now let me just mention a few things to you. And I had not thought too much about this until I started reading and studying about old Balaam. Let's think about it for a moment. I remember going to the movies when I was a young boy, and I saw a movie called Gone with the Wind. Scarlett and Rhett Butler. Not Brett, Rhett. And Scarlett had just messed over Rhett to the point that he had it with her, and he told her, he says, now, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. First time I'd ever heard a curse word. From that moment, I mean in the movies, from that moment on, they began to add more and more. I remember watching Lucy and Desi and Dick Van Dyke, Merle Tyler Moore in their show, and when they went into the bedroom, they had twin beds, and you never saw them in the same bed together. Now, over a process of time, we have moved on. We've become more progressive, they said. And we have gotten away from that old-fashioned stuff. And so we now have X-rated movies, R-rated movies, triple X-rated movies, and you can see just about anything, and I'm not going to say that you want to see, but you can see just about anything that's done. All types of perversion on television, in the movies. In fact, many times they'll put those types of things in there because that's what the people want. They want that type of thing. They want to see sex. They want to be involved in it. Hence your soap operas. People are attracted to them to the point that they will not miss their stories. They will not. We have television like Dancing with the Stars. And those stars show just about as much as they possibly can show. I can't go on without saying what took place recently. It put Syria on the back burner. It put everything that was going on in our country, Benghazi, the NSA scandal and all that, it was Miley Cyrus. Now, little old Miley used to be Hannah Montana, has grown up. And the show that she put on was the talk of the nation. And the sad part is that many people agreed with her. Right on, they'd say, as they tweeted, "You did good, Miley." I think back of some of the shows that used to be on television when Cher used to do her thing. She showed about as much as she could at that time. And then comes Madonna and Lady Gaga. And I don't know what goes on in their shows that they have live and their audience and so forth. But think about how far we've come. From the old days, back when I was growing up, you didn't mention sex. Parents didn't talk to the children about sex. They didn't say anything about it. I always had to find out what I had to find out from the guys. And the guys didn't know anything. It was all smut, and they just didn't know. So we had to learn as we went along. I saw a commercial the other day for Nutrisystem. Now, that's to help you lose weight. But Terry Bradshaw came on and she said, "I lost 38 pounds. Try that on for size." And the little old gal comes up with a little skimpy bikini and says, "I lost 38 pounds. You try that on for size." And here she came out with that little bikini and strutting nothing but much but a button and a bow. Remember that song? I saw another commercial with this beautiful black Hyundai. It was at night. And it showed this young lady. It was at nights and the lights were flashing. The car was beautiful. And then it showed these ruby red lips, just glistening. And it focused on her eyes. And she was going back to her 20-year school reunion. And she pulled that black car up and she stepped out with that mini skirt. And all the guys just oogled at her. And all the guys probably wanted to go out and buy a black Honda the next day. I'm sure they did. And that's the way it is in your commercials. We have Miss America contests. We have Miss Universe contests. Recently, they wouldn't let them hold it in a Muslim country because they wouldn't let them wear bikinis. Boy, that really caused an uproar. I also got to thinking, and I went on the internet and I looked up country music. And I said, well, I'm going to just see if I can get some titles to country music. And it run off about 500 of them, sheet after sheet after sheet. And so many of them, the titles had love in it, but love in a different connotation from what you and I understand in 1 Corinthians 13. We loved all night, and it went on and on and on. So, you know, we've kind of grown to accept that, haven't we? I listen to country music. You realize that many of the classicals were written by perverts, homosexuals. Beautiful music, seemingly. But our music has influenced us. Our television has influenced us. Our movies have influenced us. Our internet. I was surprised when I heard some of the things that went across Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. I have no idea why it is that human beings would want to take pictures of their body parts and put it out on the airwaves and send it to other people. It would have embarrassed me to death for everybody to be caught in a compromising position, but not today. They want to, this guy that's running for mayor up in New York City had to resign Congress because he was sending parts of his anatomy to certain women, and his wife forgave him, and right in the middle of the race, he does it again. I don't, you know, it's like they're obsessed with it. When I went to the West Virginia Penitentiary as warden in 1992, I went into my office and they had a stack of magazines on the corner of my desk, about this high. I said, "What's that?" They said, "That's magazines we've taken from the inmates, but we can't tell if it's pornography or not." I said, "Oh, okay." So I opened up a couple of pages, looked at the centerfolds, and I said, "That's pornography." Believe me, but the judges couldn't determine what was pornography, whether to allow it, whether not to allow it. And so people have gotten so involved in that to the point that they can't determine whether pornography has had any impact on rapes and child molestations. Are we crazy? Have we become insane as a nation? Are we so blinded we can't see? It doesn't take a genius to figure it out. You sit and look at that stuff all day, and the next thing you know, you're going to get involved in it. You can't help it. That's human nature. And Satan knows that. And hence he has used the liberal media to bring it about, just as he did with Balaam. Balaam knew what to do under Satan's influence, and Satan knows what to do today. You realize that pornography is a multi-billion-dollar business? And now they're using civil rights to get it across. The very Constitution that we as a nation were founded upon, they're using civil rights to abort children and to bring about homosexuality. We've come a long way, haven't we, to get where we are today. The divorce rate is over 50%. Unwed mothers, particularly in the black community, is about 77%. That's a lot. And they can't understand that it's because our society is in the shape it's in because there's a breakdown in the family. I remember a guy came in one time and I was working with this. I said, "What have you been doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm just making babies." That was a term that just sickened me. Making babies. Have a child with a woman and walk off and leave it, not take care of it. And that's the way our society is today. Just as it was in Sodom and Gomorrah, our society is accepting it. Over 50% of the people have now accepted homosexuality. And we're becoming more liberal all along. There was not a tremendous outrage over what Miley Cyrus did. More power to you, Miley. One woman says, "Just do it. Just keep your tongue in your mouth next time," he said. I guess her tongue was about a foot long and it stuck halfway around in her ear. I'm exaggerating, I believe, but she did have her tongue sticking out as she was singing and her wild gestures. So it goes on and on and on. So having said that, we need to make no mistake. Satan, the devil, hasn't changed a bit. He's walking around like a roaring lion seeking who he may destroy. And we as a nation have fallen right into it. Now we can understand how he has deceived the whole world, can't we? And God sends a message to his church. Don't get caught up in it. It can happen. It can happen overnight. It can happen at work. It can happen at a restaurant. It can happen at church services. It can happen anywhere. If you allow your mind to wander and you allow yourself to get involved in improper thoughts, it can happen anywhere, anytime. So we learned the lesson from Balaam. If it worked for Balaam, it'll work today. So don't fall into that trap because it's out there. And God tells us, "Come out of her, my people, and don't be partakers of her plagues." He sends us a warning. And so we need to be watching what we're listening to. We need to watch, I don't mean watch, but we need to be alert and aware of what we're seeing on our television screens. And let's not fall into that trap. Let's heed God's warning.